She didn't wait for me to knock, didn't hesitate, didn't even pretend to question why I was standing in my own driveway with keys in my hand. HOA Karen's voice cut across the cold mountain air before my truck engine had fully died. Sharp, loud, and already convinced she was right. "You need to leave," she said, like it wasn't even a discussion. Like the house behind her hadn't just been wired into my name days earlier. I stepped out onto gravel that belonged to me, felt it crunch under my boots like something breaking, and realized immediately this wasn't confusion. This was control. There were cars in my driveway that I didn't recognize, curtains in my windows that I didn't hang, and smoke rising from a chimney I hadn't even seen in person yet. They weren't visiting. They were settled. And HOA Karen stood on my porch like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Like my arrival was an inconvenience she had already decided to remove. I told her there had to be a mistake, but she didn't even let the sentence finish. She cut it off mid-air, stepped forward, and pointed back at the house like it was proof enough. "This property belongs to my family," she said, louder this time. Louder in a way that wasn't meant for me, but for anyone who might be listening. That's when her husband came out behind her, slower, heavier, carrying himself like someone who didn't need to rush because the outcome was already decided. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't check anything. He just looked at me like I was already wrong. "You got scammed," he said flatly, like he'd said it before, like it was part of a script he knew would land. And just like that, they tried to rewrite reality in front of me. I pulled the deed out of the folder I hadn't even put away yet, held it up so there was no confusion, no room for interpretation, nothing but paper backed by law. But HOA Karen didn't read it. She barely glanced at it before waving it off like it didn't matter, like documentation was just noise compared to what she had already established. And then she said something that locked everything into place. "Possession matters more than paper, not legally, not technically, but practically." And standing there, looking past her into my own house where someone else's life was already unfolding, I realized she wasn't wrong in the way that mattered most, because they had already moved in, furniture placed, food cooking, lights on, presence established. And presence buys time. Time buys leverage. Leverage breaks people who aren't ready for it. That's what this was. Not ownership, not confusion, a pressure system already in motion. I hadn't even stepped inside my own, and they were already forcing me into a position where proving it was mine wouldn't be enough, because proving it wasn't the same as enforcing it, and enforcement is where most people lose. Not because they're wrong, but because they're exhausted before the system catches up. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The sheriff showed up 20 minutes later, and that was supposed to be the moment everything reset. That was supposed to be the line where reality stepped back in and corrected what was happening. I handed him the deed without saying much, because I didn't need to say anything. It was all there. Clean purchase, verified title, everything documented the way it's supposed to be. He looked at it, nodded slightly, and then did the one thing that shifted everything in their favor. He stepped back. "This is a civil matter," he said, like it was routine, like it didn't matter that I was standing outside my own house while strangers lived inside. That sentence didn't just delay action. It gave them ground, because now they weren't trespassers. They were occupants in a dispute, and disputes don't get resolved immediately. They get scheduled, processed, delayed, and every second of delay worked for them, not me. HOA Karen smiled when he said it. Not big, not obvious, just enough to show she knew exactly what that meant. She didn't argue anymore. She didn't need to. The system had already shifted into a position she understood how to use, and I stood there watching it happen, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't anger yet, wasn't frustration, something colder than that. Clarity, because the moment the system stepped back, the situation changed completely. This wasn't about proving ownership. It was about surviving pressure, and they were already ahead. I got back in my truck, not because I was leaving, but because standing there wasn't going to change anything. They had already built their position. They had already forced the situation into a place where immediate resolution wasn't possible. And the longer I stayed in that driveway arguing, the more I played into what they want. Reaction, frustration, mistakes. So I pulled away. Slow, controlled, because walking away in that moment wasn't losing. It was repositioning. And the second I hit the bottom of that mountain road, I knew exactly what this was going to become. Not a dispute, not a misunderstanding. A fight built on time, pressure, and the assumption that I would break before they did. And that's where HOA Karen made her biggest mistake, because she didn't know who she was dealing with. She thought I was just another buyer, another outsider, another person who would look at the situation, calculate the cost, and decide it wasn't worth. But I wasn't calculating whether I could afford to fight. I was deciding how far I was willing to go to finish it. And once that decision was made, there was no version of this where I walked away. I didn't end up on that mountain because I got lucky, and I didn't get there because I made some impulsive decision in the middle of the night. Everything that led me to that driveway was built over years that didn't leave space for mistakes. Years where every dollar had a purpose and every decision had weight behind it. I'm not the kind of person who throws money at something and hopes it works out. I've spent most of my life working in environments where guessing gets you hurt and assumptions cost you more than you can afford to lose. You learn fast in that kind of work. You verify everything. You double check. You don't trust anything until you've seen it hold under pressure. That mindset doesn't disappear when you leave the job site. It follows you into everything, especially something as serious as buying property. The house wasn't a random find. It wasn't something I stumbled into without thinking it through. It was something I had been working toward for years, long before I ever saw the listing. My wife and I used to talk about it in quiet moments, not like a dream we would chase someday, but like a plan we were slowly building into something real. A place away from everything that never stops moving. A place that didn't demand anything from us except that we show up and live in it. When she got sick, those conversations changed. They got sharper, more focused, because time stopped feeling like something we had plenty of. Before she passed, she told me not to wait anymore, not to keep pushing life further down the road like there would always be another chance to start it. That wasn't advice. That was direction, and I took it seriously. After she was gone, I didn't rush into anything. I kept working, kept saving, kept doing things the way I always had, slow and controlled, because that's how you build something that doesn't collapse when pressure hits it. No shortcuts, no risks I didn't understand, just consistent effort stacked over time until it turned into something solid. That's how I had the money to buy that house outright. No loans tied to it, no dependency on approval, no weak points, just a clean purchase backed by years of discipline. When I found the property, it wasn't perfect, and that was part of the reason I wanted it. It needed work, real work. The kind of work I knew how to do. The structure was there, the land was right. The location gave me exactly what I had been looking for, without needing to say it out loud. It wasn't about luxury, it was about control, about having something that belonged to me in a way that couldn't be taken easily. And I made sure of that. Full title search, not surface level. Deep ownership history, liens, disputes, anything that could come back later and create problems. It came back clean. No overlaps, no claims, no complications hiding in the background waiting for the right moment to surface. I didn't stop there. Inspection done, structure verified, foundation solid, roof manageable, systems outdated but functional. Everything exactly where I expected it to be for something built decades ago. There was no red flag, no warning, nothing that suggested what I would walk into the moment I arrived. The money transfer was clean, every dollar accounted for, every document signed and recorded the way it's supposed to be. No shortcuts in the process, no gaps they could point to later and say I missed something. Legally, it was airtight. That's why what happened hit different, because it didn't come from something I overlooked. It came from someone deciding the process didn't matter if they were willing to push hard enough against it. The drive up there should have been simple. It should have been the start of something new. I remember the road narrowing as I climbed higher, the signal dropping out, the air changing in a way that made everything feel quieter, more controlled. It felt like stepping out of one life and into another. I wasn't expecting resistance. I wasn't expecting anything except to step out of my truck, walk into my house, and start work. That's why the moment I saw those cars in the driveway didn't register immediately, because it didn't fit. Nothing in my preparation accounted for that, and that's where experience matters. Because instead of reacting blindly, I started processing details, movement, tone, the way HOA Karen spoke without hesitation, the way her husband backed her without question, the way neither of them even considered checking the documents I was holding. That's not how someone behaves when they believe they're right. That's how someone behaves when they believe they don't need to prove anything. That's when everything shifted. Because I stopped seeing it as a misunderstanding and started seeing it for what it was. A position they had already established, a situation they had already shaped, a strategy that depended on me reacting the wrong way. I didn't raise my voice, didn't escalate, didn't argue in circles, because argument wasn't going to change anything at that stage. They weren't trying to be right. They were trying to hold ground, and holding ground doesn't require proof. It requires time. That's what they were buying. Time to force the situation into a place where removing them would cost more than leaving them. Time to turn something clear into something complicated. Time to make ownership feel like a problem instead of a fact. That's where most people lose. Not because they're wrong, because they're not prepared for what it takes to stay in it. But I wasn't looking at it like that. I wasn't thinking about whether it was worth it. I was thinking about what it would take to finish it. And once you make that shift, the situation changes, because you're no longer reacting to pressure. You're preparing to outlast it. And that's where HOA Karen miscalculated. She thought I would treat this like a purchase, something optional, something I could walk away from if it got too complicated. But I wasn't treating it like that anymore. I was treating it like something that had already been taken. And once something is taken from you, walking away isn't neutral. It's surrender, and that was never an option. What HOA Karen was doing didn't start the day I showed up, and it didn't exist in isolation. The more I stepped back and looked at how everything unfolded unfolded, the clearer it became that this wasn't just one family pushing their luck. This was a system they understood, a structure they knew how to lean on, bend, and stretch just enough to make it work in their favor without snapping it completely. And that's the kind of power that doesn't look obvious until you're the one standing against it. It wasn't written anywhere. There wasn't some official rule that said they could take over someone else's property and get away with it. But there were gaps, weak points, places where enforcement slowed down, where decisions got delayed, where the right tone and the right connections could turn something immediate into something that dragged out long enough to become a problem instead of a solution. That's where HOA Karen lived, not in the law, but in the space around it. The first real sign was how quickly the situation shifted once her name carried weight. She didn't explain herself like someone unsure. She didn't check facts like someone trying to confirm any. She asserted, she declared, and more importantly, she acted like she had already been through this kind of situation before and knew exactly how it would play out. That kind of confidence doesn't come from guessing. It comes from repetition. Her husband's role made that even clearer. He wasn't just another person standing in my driveway. He was tied into the part of the system most people never see until it starts working against them. Inspections, permits, approvals, the quiet checkpoints that determine whether something moves forward or gets buried under delay. When someone operates inside that system and benefits from it at the same time, the balance shifts before anything even begins. And that's exactly what I was walking into. The sheriff's response confirmed it without needing to say it directly. He didn't challenge them, didn't press for proof, didn't question the story they were telling even when it didn't align with what I was holding in my hand. He defaulted to delay. Civil matter. Two words that sound neutral but aren't, because in a situation like that, neutrality isn't equal. It favors whoever is already inside, and they were inside. That's how the structure works. It doesn't need to openly break rules. It just needs to slow them down in the right places. HOA Karen understood that better than most people ever will. She didn't argue law because she didn't need to. She focused on presence, on occupation, on turning something that should have been immediate into something that would take time to unwind. And time, in that situation, was the most valuable thing she could hold, because the longer they stayed inside, the more complicated it became to remove them. The more complicated it became, the more expensive it got. The more expensive it got, the more likely I would start asking myself the question they were counting on. Is this worth it? That's the pressure point. Not legality, endurance. They weren't trying to prove they owned the house. They were trying to make owning it feel like a burden I didn't want to carry anymore. And the system, whether intentionally or not, was giving them exactly what they needed to make that happen. The letter that came next made it even clearer. Cease and desist. Legal language designed not to clarify anything, but to intimidate. It questioned my ownership without providing real evidence. It hinted at consequences that stretched beyond the property itself. Lawsuits, financial complications, administrative issues that could follow me into areas of my life that had nothing to do with that house. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about expanding the cost of continuing. That's how pressure gets layered. You don't hit one angle, you hit multiple. You create friction everywhere, and then you wait. At the same time, smaller things started happening that didn't make sense on their own, but made perfect sense together. Complaints filed that didn't hold weight, but still had to be addressed. Financial interruptions triggered by claims that couldn't be verified, but still caused delays. Processes that should have been straightforward suddenly requiring extra steps, extra reviews, extra time. Individually, each one could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern, and that pattern pointed directly back to them. This wasn't random. It was coordinated, not in a way that would be obvious to someone looking quickly, but in a way that became undeniable if you tracked it long enough. Every delay, every complication, every small obstruction lined up with the same outcome, slowing me down while they stayed in place. That's when the situation fully shifted in my mind. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a system being used against me. And systems don't collapse because you argue with them. They collapse when you expose how they're being used. That's where documentation became more important than anything else. Not just proving I owned the house, but proving how the situation was being manipulated. Every interaction recorded, every inconsistency noted, every delay tracked. Because once you build a record like that, it stops being one person's problem. It becomes something bigger, something visible, and visibility changes everything. People inside the system can ignore one complaint. They can dismiss one incident, but they can't ignore a pattern that's documented across multiple points. because once that pattern exists, it forces attention from places that don't operate the same way the local structure does, places where influence doesn't carry the same weight, places where decisions are made based on what can be proven, not who is involved. That's when HOA Karen's position started weakening, not because she changed anything, because the situation expanded beyond her control. And when that happens, the structure that was protecting someone starts turning into the thing that exposes them. She didn't adjust, didn't pull back. She pushed harder, more pressure, more claims, more attempts to reinforce the version of reality she had already created. But pressure only works when the foundation behind it is stable, and hers wasn't anymore. It was starting to crack, and once something like that cracks, it doesn't fail slowly. It fails all at once. She just didn't see it coming yet. The moment everything started turning wasn't loud, and it didn't look like a breakthrough at first. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, no sudden collapse of their position. It came from something buried, something small enough that most people would have ignored it, but precise enough that once it was understood, it couldn't be undone. Because up until that point, HOA Karen's entire strategy depended on confusion, holding long enough to become reality. Confusion about ownership, confusion about history, confusion about what was actually true versus what was being repeated with enough confidence to sound true. But confusion only works until something cuts through it clean. That cut came from records, not the surface level ones, the deeper ones, the kind most people don't check because they assume the process already did it for them. But processes don't always catch intent. People do. And once I started looking beyond what was handed to me and into what had been there long before I arrived, things began to separate, not slowly, but clearly. Dates didn't line up the way HOA Karen's story required them to. Ownership history didn't support the version she was pushing. And more importantly, the connections she was relying on weren't strong enough to survive verification. The first piece that mattered was a tax record that didn't belong where it was found. Misfiled, old, overlooked, but tied to land in that exact area. At first glance, it looked irrelevant. Different parcel, different time, different situation. But when we mapped it against the current property lines, something became clear. It overlapped just enough to create confusion if someone wanted it to. Not legally, not definitively, but narratively. And that's all HOA Karen had been using. Narrative. Because legally, she didn't have anything. But narratively, she had just enough to make it sound believable to someone who wasn't digging deep. That's why she never leaned on documents. She leaned on confidence, on tone, on repetition. Because if she could keep the story intact long enough, it didn't matter what the truth actually was. But the record didn't support her. It showed that her family had once been connected to land in the area. Not this land, not this house. A different parcel entirely. Smaller, separate, lost years ago due to unpaid taxes. Disconnected from what she was claiming in every way that actually mattered. The only thing connecting it was proximity. And proximity isn't ownership. It's confusion waiting to be used. So we removed the confusion, not by arguing, by measuring. A full boundary survey. Not approximate, not assumed. Exact. Equipment, coordinates, historical alignment, everything verified against records that didn't change based on opinion. It took time. It cost money I didn't want to spend. But this wasn't the moment to hesitate, because once that survey came back, there wouldn't be anything left for them to stand on. When the results came in, they didn't just support my position. They erased theirs completely. The house sat entirely within my property lines. The land followed a clean, uninterrupted chain of ownership going back decades. No overlap, no shared boundary, no gray area that could be stretched into something it wasn't. And the land her family had once been tied to? It existed, but it wasn't here. 3 acres, wooded, irrelevant to the house she was occupying. That distinction ended everything, because once you remove confusion, the story collapses. There's nothing left to hold it up, no angle to argue, no version of events that fits both the facts and the claim. My lawyer didn't wait. Everything was filed immediately. Survey, historical records, chain of title, all aligned into a single presentation that didn't ask the court to interpret anything. It showed the court what already existed. The hearing didn't feel like a fight. It felt like confirmation. HOA Karen's side tried to slow it down, asked for time, tried to stretch it the same way they had been stretching everything else. But delay only works when there's uncertainty, and there wasn't any left. The judge didn't entertain it, didn't complicate it, didn't leave room for it. Eviction granted. 48 hours. That was it. And just like that, everything they had built started collapsing. Not gradually, immediate, because their entire entire position depended on ambiguity, and ambiguity was gone. HOA Karen didn't handle it quietly. She pushed, raised her voice, tried to turn the moment back into something she could control. But control doesn't come from volume, it comes from leverage. And she didn't have any left. That's when her husband approached me outside. No audience, no performance, just direct. He said it wasn't over, not as a threat meant to scare me, as a statement of intent. And then he made it clear he would destroy the house before letting me take it. That wasn't frustration. That was a decision for me. And that's when I understood something that hadn't been fully clear before. Winning legally didn't end the situation. It changed it, because once they lost control inside the system, they would look for ways to control what happened outside it. The call came hours later. Fire marshal, anonymous report, hazardous materials on the property, inspection required before eviction enforcement, delay, exactly where they needed, exactly when they. That wasn't coincidence. That was reaction. Because once the legal argument failed, they shifted to process, slowing things down, creating obstacles, buying time in a different way. But this time it didn't land the same, because now we understood the pattern. We weren't reacting anymore. We were anticipating. The inspection was scheduled immediately. No waiting, no gaps, controlled timing, witnesses present, visibility in. Because if they tried something again, it wasn't going to happen in a space they could manipulate. Everything was documented. Everything was positioned. Everything was ready. Because this wasn't about proving ownership anymore. That was done. This was about forcing the end to happen cleanly, without interference. And if they tried to interfere again, this time, it wouldn't stay contained. It would be seen. And once something like that is seen clearly, it doesn't stay small. It spreads. And when it spreads, it takes everything with it. The morning everything broke didn't feel like a victory waiting to happen. It felt like pressure that had been building for too long, finally reaching a point where it couldn't hold anymore. The mountain air was heavy, thick with cold and silence that didn't feel natural. It felt like something was about to snap. I pulled up before sunrise, headlights cutting through fog that hung low like it didn't want anything to be seen clearly yet. My lawyer stepped out beside me. The reporter was already there, camera equipment set up, not hidden, not subtle, fully visible for anyone watching to understand exactly what was about to happen. This wasn't private anymore. That was the difference. Every move from this point forward would exist in the open. The house was awake, lights on, movement inside. They knew, not just that we were coming, what this meant. Because once you reach that stage, there are only two directions left: acceptance or escalation. And HOA Karen didn't know how to accept anything. The fire marshal arrived exactly on time. No hesitation, no conversation beyond what was necessary. He didn't come there to listen to arguments. He came there to verify conditions. That alone shifted the balance immediately, because for the first time since this started, someone was stepping into the situation who wasn't part of the structure HOA Karen had been relying on. No connections, no influence, no reason to delay, just process. Her husband tried to control the doorway, tried to question authority, tried to slow it down, but real authority doesn't argue, it moves. And the moment the marshal stepped inside, everything changed from narrative to evidence. We stayed outside, watching, recording, waiting. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate, because this wasn't just an inspection. This was the last place they could try to manipulate what happened next. If they had planned something, if they had staged anything, if they had one more move left to play before losing control completely, this was where it would surface. When the marshal came back out, he didn't need to say much. His expression carried it first. Then the details followed. Containers in the basement, unmarked, hidden, not stored legally, not declared. And when he checked them, everything connected directly back to HOA Karen's husband's company. Registered materials, logged as disposed months earlier, but sitting inside my house. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't confusion. That was traceable. And traceable means undeniable. HOA Karen came out fast when she realized what had been found. Not calm, not controlled. She pointed at me immediately, trying to redirect everything before it settled. Accused me of planting it. Said I was setting them up. Said the entire situation was fabricated. But denial doesn't work when evidence doesn't rely on belief. Serial numbers don't change because someone raises their voice. Records don't shift because someone refuses to accept them. And the moment she realized that, she made the mistake that ended everything. She lunged, not at me, at the camera, because in that moment the threat wasn't what had been found. It was the fact that it was being seen. And once something like that is seen clearly, it can't be controlled again. State police stepped in immediately. No hesitation, no warning. They restrained her, cuffed her, and pulled her away while cameras captured every second of it. That wasn't just an arrest. That was the collapse of everything she had built. Because her entire position relied on perception, and perception doesn't survive when behavior becomes undeniable. Her husband didn't react the same way. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't escalate. He just stood there, watching everything unfold unravel, like he finally understood there was no version of this where it went back to what it was before. Then he asked for something he hadn't asked for once before. Time, not to fix anything, not to fight, to gather his family. 2 hours, that was all he asked. And standing there, after everything they had done, I had a choice: end it immediately, or give them time. I gave them 2 hours, not because they deserved it, because not everyone inside that house chose to be part of what happened, and that decision revealed exactly what they had left. Because the moment they went back inside, the destruction started. Windows shattered from the inside, walls marked, furniture broken, not chaotic, intentional. If they couldn't keep it, they would make sure I paid for it. State police moved again, pulled them out, another arrest, another collapse, and just like that, it was over. Not gradually, immediately. The house was empty. For the first time since I arrived, I stepped inside, not as someone trying to claim it, as someone who had forced it back into reach. The damage was worse than expected, not neglect, retaliation. Every room showed it, every surface carried it. This wasn't about living there. It was about making sure no one else could do it without paying for it. But standing there, in the middle of everything they had done, one thing was clear: they were gone. Not temporarily, not conditionally, gone. And everything they had used to stay there had collapsed all at once. Outside, the cameras were still rolling. The story was already moving. Because once something like this reaches that level of visibility, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. And when it spreads, it doesn't just take the moment with it. It takes everything connected to it. HOA Karen didn't lose control slowly. She lost it all at once. And once that happens, there's no getting it back. What came after the collapse didn't feel like momentum slowing down. It felt like everything accelerating at once in directions HOA Karen couldn't control anymore. Because the moment that footage left that driveway, the situation stopped belonging to her. It stopped being something she could manage locally, stopped being something she could influence through tone, pressure, or connections. It became something visible, and visibility changes the rules completely. The video didn't spread because it was dramatic. It spread because it was clear. No interpretation needed, no explanation required. People saw exactly what happened, and once they saw it, the version of events HOA Karen had been pushing collapsed instantly. The same spaces where she had built support turned on her without hesitation, not gradually, completely. And once perception flips like that, there's no pulling it back. That's when the attention shifted, not just from people watching, from people who investigate. Because once something like that reaches a certain level, it stops being ignored. It starts being examined, not casually, not superficially, but systematically. Every detail pulled apart, every connection checked, every timeline reviewed. And that's where HOA Karen's situation became something she couldn't navigate anymore. Her husband's role was the first thing that drew focus, not because it was obvious, because it was connected. Inspection records, permits, approvals, everything he had touched started being reviewed under a different lens, not as routine work, but as part of a pattern that needed to be verified. And once that process starts, it doesn't stop at one point. It expands. It looks for consistency. It looks for repetition. It looks for anything that suggests what happened at my house wasn't isolated, and it found it. Projects that didn't line up, approvals that moved faster than they should have, inspections that didn't match the condition of what they were approving. Individually, each one could have been dismissed. Together, they formed something else, a pattern, and patterns are what turned suspicion into action. Environmental violations came next, because what was found in that basement didn't exist in isolation. Those containers weren't just improperly stored, they were recorded as disposed, meaning someone had already claimed they no longer existed. That alone shifted the situation into something that couldn't be handled locally anymore. Because once documentation is falsified, it becomes more than negligence. It becomes intentional. And intentional violations don't stay small. They trigger involvement from places that don't operate on familiarity or influence. Places where decisions are made based on what can be proven, not who is involved. That's where the situation moved. And once it moved there, HOA Karen lost control completely. The digital side followed. The attempt to fabricate evidence, the audio file, the effort to create a version of me that didn't exist. That wasn't just desperation. That was escalation into something far more serious. Because once you cross into manipulation at that level, you're no longer dealing with a dispute. You're dealing with a crime that leaves a trail, and trails get followed. It didn't take long. The source was traced, connections confirmed, and once it tied back into their circle, that was it. There was no separation left, no plausible distance. Everything connected, everything reinforced everything else. And once that happens, there's no strategy left to reverse it. HOA Karen tried to respond, tried to regain control through visibility again, but it didn't land, because once credibility is gone, every word that follows is filtered through doubt, and doubt doesn't support recovery, it accelerates collapse. Her statements started sounding forced, worst. Her explanation started contradicting what was already proven, and every time she tried to speak, it made things worse. Because she wasn't correcting anything. She was exposing how much of it had been built on something that couldn't hold. Her support disappeared, not slowly, immediately. Because support based on perception doesn't survive evidence, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. At the same time, the consequences started stacking in ways she couldn't stop. Licenses reviewed, then removed. Positions suspended, then terminated. Financial pressure followed, because once credibility collapses, everything tied to it weakens at the same time. Business dropped. Opportunities disappeared. The network she relied on stopped responding the way it used to. That's how systems correct themselves. Not out of fairness, out of necessity. Because once something becomes visible at that level, maintaining it becomes riskier than removing it. And risk is something institutions act on immediately. Meanwhile, I was still inside the house dealing with what they left behind. Because while everything around the situation was escalating, the reality inside those walls hadn't changed yet. Damage. Deliberate. Every HOA room needed work. Every system needed to be checked. And as we started opening things up, more came out. Hidden compartments. Stored materials. Evidence that the house had been used for more than just living. That confirmed everything. This wasn't a one-time move. It was part of something ongoing. And that made the consequences even heavier. Because now it wasn't just about what happened to me. It was about what had been happening before me. That's what expert involvement does. It doesn't just resolve the immediate situation, it exposes the entire structure behind it. And once that structure is exposed, it doesn't go back to operating the same way. HOA Karen didn't lose control in one moment. She lost it when the situation moved beyond her reach. She just didn't realize it until everything started closing in at once. Because that's how it happens. Pressure builds quietly, controlled, manageable, until it isn't. And when it releases, it doesn't come apart slowly. It collapses all at once. And by the time it does, there's nothing left to hold on to. By the time everything finally settled, there was no moment that felt like a win. No single point where everything stopped and handed closure. What came instead was something quieter, something colder, something that didn't need to announce itself because it was already complete. The house stood where it had always stood. The land didn't shift. The structure didn't change. The only thing that changed was control. And now that control wasn't being questioned by anyone. The legal side didn't end with noise. It ended with removal. Every claim HOA Karen had built collapsed under documentation that didn't leave room for interpretation. Every delay she relied on stopped working the moment the situation moved beyond her reach. The system that had slowed everything down corrected itself when it no longer had the option to ignore what was in front of it. And once it corrected, it didn't hesitate. Her position didn't weaken. It disappeared. Licenses gone. Authority removed. Influence reduced to nothing. The same structure she had used to hold control became the mechanism that exposed her completely. Not because it suddenly became fair, but because it became visible. And once something is visible at that level, it doesn't matter who you are or who you know. It gets processed the same way everything else does. There were no more letters, no more calls, no more attempts to shape anything. Silence replaced everything, and that silence carried more weight than anything she had said from the beginning. Her husband's situation closed the same way, not in one decision, but in a series of outcomes that stacked until there was nothing left supporting him. Investigations turned into charges. Charges turned into consequences that didn't leave space for recovery. What had been hidden inside routine work was now documented permanently. Patterns that had gone unnoticed were now recorded in a way that couldn't be undone. There was no version of events left where he could explain it away, because explanation only works when doubt exists. And there was no doubt left. Back at the house, the work was done. Not perfect, not untouched by what happened, but complete. Every repair removed another piece of what they left behind. Every replacement pushed the space further away from what it had been during that time. And eventually there was nothing inside those walls that still felt temporary. Nothing that suggested it had ever been controlled by anyone else. It wasn't reclaimed anymore. It was settled. The people who showed up didn't disappear when everything ended. They didn't step back once the situation stopped being visible. They stayed, quietly, without expectation. Because what had formed through all of this wasn't tied to the conflict. It was tied to the outcome. And outcomes like that don't need reinforcement. Time passed. Not measured in events. Measured in the absence of them. No interruptions. No interference. No attempts to reopen something that was already finished. Just consistency. The kind that only exists when nothing is left unresolved. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't about beating HOA Karen. It was about ending the situation in a way that couldn't be reversed. Because if something can be reversed, it isn't finished. This was finished. Not because I said it was. Because there was nothing left that could change it. Standing outside one evening, Looking at the house, there was no sense of reclaiming anything. That part had already passed. What was left was simpler. Ownership without resistance, control without interference. A situation that didn't require attention anymore because it had reached its final state. HOA. Karen didn't come back, didn't send anything, didn't try to rebuild any version of what she had started, because there was nothing left to rebuild it with. Everything she had relied on, pressure, perception, influence, was gone, and without those things, there was no way back into it. So it ended the only way something like this actually ends. Not with a final argument, not with a state, not with anything loud enough to mark it. It ended in silence, complete, cold, and permanent. HOA Karen went silent. Nobody argued after that.